The first known documentation of an enslaved black girl named Thursday is a fugitive slave advertisement placed by the white male enslaver John Rock on Tuesday, the 1st of September, 1772. Printed on page 3 of the Nova Scotia Gazette and the Weekly Chronicle, the notice claimed that Thursday had absconded on Monday, the 18th of August. The ad read in part, quote, "And whosoever may be so kind to take her up and send her home to her said master shall be paid all costs and charges, together with $2 reward for their trouble," end quote. While the phrases "take her up" and "send her home" belie the violence that was obviously entailed in the process of recapture, the offer of a reward and cost is indicative of the importance of Thursday's labor and her overall value to the Rock household. Ubiquitous across the Americas, fugitive or runaway slave advertisements were printed in newspapers or as broadsides, what we would today call posters, to alert the public about enslaved people who resisted through flight. Enslavers tried to limit black enslaved resistance through surveillance, physical brutality, psychological control and manipulation, and other forms of terror. However, enslaved resistance was ubiquitous, and running away was particularly destabilizing to the institution of slavery. For the brave individuals like Thursday, permanent escape from the systemic brutality of slavery was often the ultimate goal. However, enslavers like John Rock and their surrogates like printers used the medium of print, monetary rewards, and legal threats to incentivize the public to aid in the recapture and re-enslavement of runaways. As was typical in a moment before photography had been invented, Rock's ads sought to conjure a visual image of Thursday in the minds of the newspaper readers. Indeed, fugitive slave advertisements were the precursor to the mugshot. As David Wallstreicher has noted, such ads were generally premised on 4 categories: clothing, trades or skills, linguistic ability or usage, and ethnic or racial identity, categories the manipulation of which could alter the perception of one's class and race. Although he did not mention her skills, language ability, or ethnicity, Rock described Thursday as a, quote, Negro girl, about 4.5 feet high, broad set, wearing a red cloth petticoat, a red baize gown, and a red ribbon about her head, end quote. Interestingly, what Rock described as a ribbon may have been an example of the West African dress practice of head wrapping, since white people often did not know or fully appreciate the African cultural practices that enslaved and free blacks fought to maintain. The visual dimensions of fugitive slave ads were often paramount, the text resulting in a dubious portrait of a fleeing sitter, a runner actually, who of course had never authorized the representation of their likeness. Such ads therefore resulted from a representational violence made possible by the pervasive control that white enslavers exerted over enslaved populations. For the enslaved, this control resulted in a lack of access to technology, like the printing press, prohibitions on literacy, material deprivation, an overarching lack of cultural and economic capital, and physical brutality, all of which were systemic and strategic. Of this last category, Rock's statement that Thursday had, quote, a lump above her right eye, end quote, most likely documented a mark of violence that had been inflicted upon the small girl. If so, that a protuberance was still visible and provided as an identifying mark demonstrates the impunity with which Rock and other enslavers operated. While the extraordinary brutality and material deprivation of slavery make it extremely difficult to piece together enslaved biographies, we are fortunately able to learn more about Thursday from other printed and manuscript sources. In January 1771, 20 months before Thursday's escape, A white male indentured servant named James Tweefoot fled from the Rock household. Indentureship was a long-term work contract through which an employer was typically obligated to provide food, shelter, and clothing for an employee over a period of years. Of various races and ethnicities, indentured people often suffered intolerable cruelty and frequently fled from their employers. But as free people under the law, they had a level of protection that enslaved people, defined as chattel or movable personal property, never had. We yet do not know if James and Thursday were a part of the Rock household at the same time. If so, since collaborations between enslaved people and other enslaved and indentured people from the same or different households were normal, why did they not flee together? The manuscript sources which document Thursday are from Rock's estate inventory. These documents become useful to trace what became of Thursday only because Rock predeceased her. Unfortunately, we know that Thursday was recaptured because when Rock died in 1776, Thursday was valued by his estate at £25 and sold for £20 to a man named John Bishop. As was typical of enslaved people, Thursday entered the archive in a piecemeal and fragmentary way designed to objectify her and to reify her status as chattel. That we know about Thursday at all is due in large part to her brave resistance, her flight from John Rock's house in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on Monday, August 18th, 1772.
Letter from James Morris to Michael Wallace, offering for sale a Negro servant to be employed on Sable Island. Nova Scotia Archives, Treasury Papers RG31, Series 120. Piecing together the stories of our past can be a challenge. It only becomes more of a challenge the farther back you go. We have to work with what records were kept and collected. In the case of records of government, what was kept are primarily financial records. They were very interested in tracking where the money was going and where it was coming from. Financial records may not be the first place a researcher thinks to look when digging into the province's past. But when you know how to look, you can piece together quite a story from receipts and scraps. Take the Treasury Papers, for instance. Many of the series are literally just piles of receipts and, where we were lucky, some correspondence shuffled in. I could talk at length about what we were able to piece together about the history of settlement on Sable Island from these pieces, but I really want to direct your attention to this one particular transaction, reimbursing Island Superintendent James Morris for a purchase, dated October 1806. Sir Lieutenant Hodgson of this post, being called on business to South Carolina and having 2 likely Negro servants, offer one for sale, which I have bought for £10 currency, has yet 7 years to serve, is very stout for his age, and active. I take him to the island, in order to discharge 2 of the lads from it, and doubt not but your honour will allow him reasonable wages. Please order the said £10 paid to the bearer, Mr. Samuel Stevenson. Your most obedient, humble James Morris. On the back of the document, it notes that Provincial Treasurer Michael Wallace reimbursed the £10. I had been planning on telling you that we don't know this individual's name, how long they spent on the island, or if they were provided the reasonable wages outlined in the receipt. But then I had the opportunity to look a little deeper. Commissioner's accounts current with the province for superintending Sable Island affairs, Nova Scotia Archives, RG1, Volume 424. This document, dated 1807, is the accounts for the superintending of Sable Island, where the commissioners of the island get reimbursed for spending. It is mostly a list of provisions, like fresh beef and molasses, and services like truckage and the housing of farm animals. It also includes the item, to be paid James Morris, Esquire, 10 months' wages for his indented black man, Prince, from the 6th August 1806, 20 pounds. This is most certainly a reference to the same individual mentioned in the James Morris letter. It seems he did have a name, Prince, and was paid a wage. It is noted further down on this account sheet that 2 of the existing Sable-hired servants were discharged, possibly replaced by the indentured work of Prince, as suggested in the letter. Our records of early Sable Island are, like many early collections, what they are, pieces. Pieces that sometimes, when we're lucky, fit together. Are there more pieces of Prince's story to be found in these centuries-old government financial records? It's quite possible, but will take some creative digging to discover.
First Baron Dorchester Papers, the National Archives, Q, Public Record Office 30/55/100, more commonly known as the Book of Negroes, and shared by the Nova Scotia Archives, with the consent of the British National Archives, on the website of the Nova Scotia Archives. The Book of Negroes has been described by many as the single most important document relating to the immigration of African Americans to Nova Scotia. Lawrence Hill's like-titled novel took the snippets of information found in this ledger and constructed a rich narrative which followed the main character from freedom in Africa to enslavement in America, freedom of a sword in Bridgetown and Shelburne, and then her return to Africa and Sierra Leone. This document was created as the American War of Independence was winding down. Peace negotiations had started in 1782, and the British forces under Sir Guy Carleton remained headquartered in New York, which they continued to hold as they planned for their orderly evacuation from the soon-to-be-recognized new nation. The peace agreement that was eventually signed in 1783 allowed for the departure of Loyalists and the British military with a limited amount of their property. Inventories and lists were to be made, and the new nation was for the most part not to interfere with the departure. With the lists in hand, disputes could be worked out later. This was critical, as under the Articles of Peace, the British were not to take American property or African Americans with them. The implication being that African Americans would, for the most part, have been the enslaved property of someone, Loyalist or Republican. Carleton's military predecessors had made a number of promises to free enslaved blacks to entice them to leave the plantations, disrupt the economy, to take up arms with the British. In return for their presence and support, they received the promise of transport to Nova Scotia and freedom from enslavement. Despite the Articles of Peace, Carleton decided to honor the promises made by his predecessors. So a list was made of the freed blacks being transported out of New York. Everything was documented so it could be disputed later. The list recorded names, ages, sometimes descriptions or comments on the formerly enslaved person's health, where they had been enslaved, who the purported owner had been, and how they had come to be behind British lines. In doing so, it provided a means of connecting almost every black loyalist to their origins in the United States. Somewhere on the wharves of New York, or perhaps on vessels anchored in the Hudson, American and British officials made their list. Or actually 2 lists, as each kept a copy of the record. While most were transported to Nova Scotia, and to a lesser extent New Brunswick, some were still recorded as enslaved, and some had their freedom disputed in the book. The British document becomes what is now known, after the title page, as the Book of Negroes. Way less well known and seemingly languishing at the National Archives in Washington amid the records of the Continental and Confederation Congresses and the Constitutional Convention, 1765 to 1821, that is the title, are the 2 volumes individually titled Inspection Roll of Negroes. When the British sailed from New York, the book sailed with them. It was volume 55 of the 107 that became known as the British Headquarters Papers. As was the custom of the time, these records were the personal property of the commander. Carleton had them arranged by a secretary who seems to have kept them. Although Carleton lived until 1808, the papers were gifted during his life through his secretary to the Royal Institution, which was neither part of the state or an archives or a library. Rather, it was a newly formed science centre in London that had been created to introduce new technologies and teach science to the general public through lectures and demonstrations. In 1939, when building a new building, the Institute disposed of the papers, which seemed to have been bought by a dealer and then flipped to prominent American businessman John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller had them restored, rebound, and plunked down in the New York Public Library. There, a photographic copy of the book was made and remains. One of Rockefeller's projects was the construction of colonial Williamsburg as a recreation of the pre-revolutionary capital of Virginia. This continues to exist as a major historical site and interpretive center for American history. So in 1935, he moved his collection, including the Book of Negroes, to the Rockefeller Library he has created as part of colonial Williamsburg. In October 1957, Queen Elizabeth visited the United States amid the celebration of the 350th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, the first place where the King's flag had been flown in America. In this festive celebration marking the ties of friendship amid the two powers once deeply divided by war, gifts were exchanged. We do not know why, but as part of the celebration, now moved to the south lawn of the White House, President Eisenhower presented Queen Elizabeth, with Winthrop Rockefeller in the background, the 107 original volumes of the Carleton Papers, including Volume 52 of the Book of Negroes, as a gift to mark the decades of friendship and peace between the two countries. Upon her return to the United Kingdom, the volumes made their way to the National Archives of the United Kingdom. In the 19th century, while the records were still at the British Institution, and before copies were made at the New York Public Library, the Nova Scotia Archives had the book copied by hand and was available for consultation in Halifax. Bill of Sale for a slave named Dinah. Nova Scotia Archives, MG 100, Volume 113, Number 51. This document is a simple bill of sale transferring the enslaved woman Dinah from Reverend John Brenton of Halifax to Peter Shea of Falmouth, Nova Scotia. The price for this, quote, Negro woman, about 25 years of age, unquote, is £23, 6 shillings and 6 pence. The document dated 19 November 1776 specifically says that Shea and his heirs may heaven hold this Negro woman forever. Curiously, it also goes on to say that Brenton will defend the title to Dinah against all persons claiming rights to or title to her. The document doesn't give the background of the parties, but we know that Brenton is the Church of England priest at St. Paul's Church in Halifax. He's also the chaplain to the House of Assembly. Shea is a landholder in Falmouth and an estate agent for Colonel Denson, a larger landholder and the owner of many slaves. We tend to think of slaveholders, if we think of them at all, as being Loyalists or New Englanders. Brenton is neither. A naval chaplain, he was at the fall of Louisbourg and the founding of Halifax. He returns to Halifax as a civilian priest in 1752. Shea is born in Ireland and in Halifax marries the daughter of the provincial secretary. We don't know where Dinah came from or what happened to her. At the time of the sale, some refugees from the War of Independence were already appearing in Halifax. We also know that Brenton wanted to leave Halifax. We know he had 8 children. While we might conjecture that Dinah was acquired to help with the household and childcare, and that the sale was in preparation for leaving Halifax, we also know that he ultimately stayed in Halifax. Shea dies in 1818, and an inventory of his estate does not include evidence that he continued to be a slaveholder. Although the document is a bill of sale, it isn't registered. It doesn't appear in the deed books. There are 2 prominent witnesses to the transactions, and they are Shea's neighbors and also prominent landholders. There are instances in Nova Scotia where we see such transactions documented in official records, but this is not one of them. The language about defending title is interesting. Is it pro forma and generally include in all such documents, or does it suggest that there was a possibility of former slaves making claims? We don't know. R versus Gray. The indictment of Jessie Gray for selling Mary Postel as a slave and kidnapping Flora Postel, her daughter. Shelburne County Court of General Sessions of the Peace. RG 60, Shelburne County, Volume 1, File 49, Part 4. This is a complex document. It's part of a case that continues over a number of years as Mary Poswell asserts her claim to be a free person against the claims of one Jessie Gray. The entry for her in Amani Whitfield's biographical dictionary of enslaved black people in the Maritimes is perhaps the longest narrative in the dictionary. Her case against re-enslavement has attracted the interest of scholars, writers, and poets. Sylvia Hamilton, writing poetry as part of George Eliot Clark's Fire in the Water anthology of Black Nova Scotian verse and narrative, notes Mary's perseverance and agency in continuing to fight for her rights as a free woman even after it is devalued when she is exchanged for a 100-pound sack of potatoes. Her freedom was attained in Carolina from a certificate of protection granted by General Leslie, who, like Birch, issued these certificates as part of the British war effort against America. Although the Book of Negroes was created as a means of documenting the individuals being transported under British protection, as for the most part free men and women, the certificates of protection did not have a registry to enforce or record them. Mary's freedom in Carolina became precarious when her certificate was snatched from her, leaving her freedom an issue of measuring the claims of a black woman against the statements of a white man. Though the relationship between Jessie Gray and Mary Poswell ends in violence and enslavement, and the revelation that Jessie was never a good man by any definition, there is earlier in the story an element that their relationship might have been closer. Some documents suggest a domestic relationship, and Jessie's land allocation in Nova Scotia is like that of a family with more land accruing because of the presence of a spouse and child. Although Mary is ultimately not successful in the courts of Nova Scotia, her case is situated in the transition from black people having to disprove an automatic assumption that they were enslaved, and thus chattel property, to the assumption that they were free, and that any claim of enslavement must only come from tested proof offered by claimants. With this gradual change, courts no longer were enforcers of enslavement. In Mary's case, the grand jury is willing to say that Jessie Gray was a wicked and evil-disposed, greedy and succour, and seeking his own profit and advantage by the loss and damage of others, end quote. But the judges were ultimately not yet finding a way in law in 1791 to deny him his property rights at the expense of Mary's freedom. Letter from James Cox, Freeman, and Grand Jury to the Magistrates of Queens County, 22nd April 1794. From the Shelburne County Court of General Sessions of the Peace. Re. Abduction of indentured free black child who was kidnapped, shipped to Antigua, and had his contract sold, or was sold into slavery. RG 34, Series 321, Item J 145. When we read this letter 228 years after it was written, we miss a lot of the context about what is going on. The text is that James Cox, writing to the magistrates, and complains that a Negro boy has been shipped off from Liverpool to the West Indies, and that this is a problem that they, the magistrates, should do something about. The administrative geography was different then. In the times since then, government structures have changed, counties have been divided, and townships no longer exist as governing entities as promised to the New England settlers. The document came to the archives as part of the Shelburne court records, but at the time, Shelburne was part of Yarmouth County. Liverpool was a sort of self-governing township. We encounter the grand jury today in American news and TV crime dramas, like Law and Order. It once existed in Nova Scotia's counties as well, but in addition to being part of the legal system, it was part of the local government as well. James Cox is the foreman of the grand jury. He speaks on their behalf. But handwriting being what it is, and Freeman being a big family name in the area, some have referred to him as James Cox Freeman. Or, in some cases, Freeman has been interpreted as a title, like Esquire or Yeoman, that might mean something in the era of slavery. Unfortunately, it is just bad handwriting here. The document also dips into the spectrum of freedom and servitude. The 18th century was a rough place. There is no real social safety net. Desperate people did desperate things, like exchanging freedom from merchant debt, which could send you to jail, for the time-limited service of a child or person in the merchant's business or household. To save yourself or family, you could rent yourself or family members out to the creditor. Unlike slavery, there is a way out through time or payment. We don't know the full story on the website with this document. The one sample document is part of a much larger file. Adding a layer to this ball of inequity, someone is indenturing out their slave. The complaint is not about slavery, but whether this indentured situation, gone bad, would discourage future instances of indentureship being created. It also seems the grand jury is more worried about the possible limitations on the practice of indentureship than the fact that it and slavery exist in their community. Additionally, all this paperwork is about a Negro boy, whose name is only mentioned once, Peter. He is clearly property and not a person. Letter of Malachi Salter to his wife about a slave. Manuscript Group 100, Volume 217, Number 27F. On the surface, this is a family letter between a married couple in September of 1759, Malachi and Suki, or Susanna. She is visiting her family in Boston. He remains in Halifax with the kids. He sends some gossip he has picked up from his friend the governor. He mentions the children, Ben in school, Mac Jr., who has a huge appetite, and their daughter Nabby, who seems to be getting too much sun for her white complexion. Then you read about Hagar, who seems to be running the household in his wife's absence. And she is doing it well, attracting compliments from Susanna's friends, who are checking in on them. You think she could be the eldest daughter. And then you read about Jack. Jack is Jack, Salter writes. Quote, he is the most deceitful villain in all of Halifax, end quote. Malachi admits to using a cat or whip daily on him. And then he writes, quote, pray that you may purchase a Negro boy if possible, end quote. In these harrowing words, you suddenly realize that Hagar and Jack are most likely the household slaves. Malachi Salter is a New England-born merchant who had been in and out of Halifax before its founding. He ran a sugar refinery and did some merchant trading. He's a family guy. Elsewhere in the letter, he is giving a shopping list of provisions for his wife to return with. He also suggests bringing back his unmarried younger sister, as he may have found a man for her. It's a normal family letter found amid a few other Salter family letters. Yet in it we find the reality of what Manny Whitfield refers to as the slave in the family home. He asks Suki, his wife, with the name usually associated with the enslaved, to be sure to bring back some gifts for Hagar, the enslaved young woman who is running the house in her absence. She is clearly part of the family in some ways, unlike Jack, who may be on the trading block if Susanna buys his replacement. The letter is part of a small collection of family correspondence that has survived. It was quoted by T.W. Smith in his Slave in Canada publication, published in Halifax in 1899. The book has no additional attribution of where Smith saw the letter 3 decades before the Nova Scotia Archives opened.